Geraldine and Tony are in their own right two really fantastic, admirable people. As a pair, they were double that. They sharpened wits against each other so much. They were each Pulitzer Prize-winners, so that they were the best at their craft. And they were so perfectly melded.
We had a joint byline very often, Geraldine Brooks, Tony Horwitz, Geraldine Brooks, and eventually the newspaper just started referring to us as Hobro. We'd become one person.
Their relationship is probably one of the all-time love stories. He really, just more than anything, I think, revered and respected and loved how smart, intelligent, and passionate she was about everything.
Well, I think they were on their honeymoon for about a good 15 years.
I'm Geraldine Brooks, and I'm in Aspen to speak at Winter Words.
I'm Tony Horwitz, and I'm here for the same reason.
We were just thinking, oh, there's so much of this ahead of us. We are going to have so many adventures. And we felt totally lucky until we weren't. I'm going back to Flinders Island. This beautiful place in the Bass Strait is where I came finally 3 years after my husband died suddenly to do the business of mourning. For 3 years after his death, I'd been pretending to be normal. And I wasn't normal. I wasn't right in the head. I wasn't myself. I see what I did straight away, which was we were so lucky. You're supposed to work through denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance, and I'd vaulted all the intermediate steps and pretended that I'd arrived at acceptance. You can't do that. I felt like this love had not been acknowledged by the capacious grief that it deserved. That's when I thought of Flinders Island.
Geraldine just said, I'm going to take myself off to this island to write about Tony. It made a lot of sense to me. In fact, it seemed like a very typically Geraldine thing to do. It was brave. It was actually walking towards the thing that was painful.
I just decided that I would take the time and space and try and do the grieving that I hadn't done. Grief counseling would have been one way to go, a therapist, but I just thought, well, what do writers do? Writers write. I came here by myself with no kids, no animals, no friends, no work. Nobody, no matter how beloved, in between me and Tony and the work of grief. I grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney. I was a very urban kid. We didn't go to the bush, we didn't camp, we didn't do any of those things.
Our world was in the backyard and in books. Imagination plays a huge part. Geraldine would have little worlds in the back garden, and it was great.
When I became a reporter on the Sydney Morning Herald, I found myself drawn to covering environmental issues, and that took me out into the bush to get to know my country. And I loved Tasmania. Right at the height of the battle to save the Franklin, I had a kind of sliding door moment because I was offered a scholarship to Columbia Graduate School of Journalism in New York City. I took the scholarship, and at Columbia, I met the man who was going to become my husband, Tony Horwitz. I was initially attracted to him because he was such an idealist. So he had this high moral seriousness and just a great sense of humor.
He was just gorgeous. He had curly blonde hair, and Geraldine said, I don't know, he's too young for me. I said, are you crazy? look at the way he looks at you. He adores you. So I think that was the best advice I've ever given Geraldine. Go for it.
We came back to my home place in Australia, and he immediately got hired by the Sydney Morning Herald. And then suddenly, out of the blue, the Wall Street Journal called and said, would I like to become the Middle East correspondent? I was just, well, there's an adventure. So for about 10 years, we had a kind of crazy life. We were always getting calls in the middle of the night, get up and write something. We lived with a duffel bag packed with crazy things. I had a chador and a bulletproof vest. We often worked on different sides of the same story. So if he was in Iraq, I would be in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War, and vice versa.
I think I was getting worried. You know, you never come down from that adrenaline. And, you know, you're going to run out of luck at some point.
I happened to turn 39 and get arrested by the Nigerian secret police at the same time. And I'm in the slammer in this unlovely lockup. And I thought, whoops, I'm 39 and I forgot to get pregnant. When I was lucky enough to get pregnant with my first child, Nathaniel, at that point, I needed a new gig. We'd been talking about adoption, and I knew that Ethiopia had an incredibly well-run adoption system. And so we were lucky enough to have 5-year-old Bizwayo come into our lives, and Bizwayo is Amharic for I have seen a lot.
I think that Nathaniel and I are the two halves of my dad. He's deeply intellectual and loves reading and politics, and I think I inherited my dad's sense of humor. I definitely carry more of his personality, and my brother carries his interests.
We'd settled on Martha's Vineyard after I had sadly failed to turn Tony into an Australian. He was an American historian at heart. He needed his country for his work in a way that once I became a novelist, I really didn't. My work was in my head. I could do it anywhere. So when I got to Flinders and I set myself up in the shack, I deliberately put myself back on the worst day of my life. I would get up in the morning and revisit, do the work, write my thoughts. And then when I realized that I had cramp and hadn't moved in hours, I'd go for a walk. I just fell in love with granite. You know, we know it as a countertop, but to see it in all its incredible diversity. And the rocks on Flinders Island are in these sculptural shapes that completely moved me in the way art moves you. I'm never anxious when I'm alone. It's not like I'm a totally fearless person. I have fears, but that's not one of them. And then I realized I wasn't alone. I was with Tony. I was able to be with him night and day. We loved sunsets. From the earliest days of our courtship, we'd go and watch a sunset, and we'd give it a grade. And we were trying to rack up as many 10s as we possibly could, and we had a very strict criteria. We always said to each other that in our dotage, we would get a place with a west-facing veranda and 2 rocking chairs, and we would never miss a sunset. So that was how I pictured my old age. So Tony had worked really hard on a tight deadline on a book about the South called Spying on the South. And it relates a journey taken by Frederick Law Olmsted. And he traveled through the South on the eve of the Civil War, asking the question, why is our country so fractured?
And Tony had the inspired idea of retracing that journey. So I said, I'll come. And he said, great. So I remember thinking, why have I agreed to do this? And I think his attitude was, oh, you actually turned up. It was fascinating to me to watch Tony at work. As he said, I'm a Yankee in Confederate country. But his ability to sit down and talk with and, more importantly, listen to people. And you think about that as a way of writing. To actually meet 10,000 different people, to try and tell a bigger story, showing respect to those people. It's a very, very hard thing to do.
And then he's on book tour, and he crossed the country in 1 week. He was in Washington, D.C., and he was going to have that day off before he went right back into it. And I'm at my desk working on my novel, and the phone rings. It's a doctor from a hospital in Washington, and I thought, oh, what's happened, and he had some kind of an accident or something. And she says he's collapsed in the street, and I'm expecting her to say, and now he's in surgery, or now we're keeping him for observation. And instead she says, he's dead. Just like that. I just couldn't assimilate it. At the end of the day, I would go for a swim. At first it was just a swim, but as I got deeper and deeper into the work, I realized that there was something almost ceremonial about it. It just became this gift to myself to be fully immersed and completely alone in my skin, in the water, like some kind of aquatic creature. And it felt cleansing and healing. When you convert to Judaism, you go to the mikveh and you just fully immerse yourself. So Tony was Jewish, and I'd always been fascinated by the history of the Jewish people. When we decided to get married, because Judaism is passed through the maternal line, I was not going to be the end of a lineage that had survived Russian pogroms and the Shoah. I wasn't going to be the end of that. So I converted as a gesture to history, as a kind of give the finger to Hitler. It was about history, not faith. I'm not a deist. And Tony was very culturally Jewish, not a deist either. If he had died and I was an Orthodox Jew, there would have been a very set roadmap to travel, a pathway into and out of grief, strict rules. The first one, I think, is incredibly insightful, that in the first hours after somebody experiences a loss like this, you don't even offer them condolences. They're in a state of stupefying grief, is how it's put. It's only after the burial that the grieving and condolences start, and that's a very set period of time called Shiva, where you sit and just let people come and talk about the deceased. And you don't bathe, you cover the mirrors, you're taken out of time. So grief, if you like, it's wallowed in. And then you're supposed to return to normal life. And other religions have this too. In Shiite Islam, there are very elaborate mourning traditions. In Tehran, I went to a Shaba Haft, which is a seventh night commemoration where a mullah comes and chants the Quran and everybody weeps. And then day 41, you go back into normal life. You take off all the black shrouds, and that's the end of the mourning period. And of course, Indigenous Australians, the Aboriginal people, sorry business, is an intense, elaborate recognition of the cataclysm that happens not just to individuals, but to the whole community that that person was a part of. As one Aboriginal elder explained it, You sit with the sorrow as long as it takes. We don't do that. I had no idea what a brutal, broken system it is when somebody dies suddenly, far from home, among strangers. There are little brutalities all the way along the line that aren't necessary. I wasn't allowed to see his body. I got to Washington thinking that I could be with him and hold his hand and say goodbye, and I get to the hospital and it's not allowed. It wasn't until days later when he was finally released to the funeral home that I was finally able to see him. So the kids, you have this kind of mad idea that you don't have to burden them with this thing straight away. My oldest son had just graduated from college and he was adventuring around the world, flying to Sydney to stay with my sister.
Nathaniel was just amazing. I don't know where he found that calm strength to carry us all through it, actually.
And Bizu, I almost didn't want to reach because he's safe at boarding school. He still has a father until I tell him that he doesn't. I called the principal of his school and they gathered him up, and then I called him, and it was just horrible having to tell him that on the telephone.
Kind of just felt like the wind was knocked out of me, and I just was there just looking. I didn't really know how to feel or react, and I don't think I really did for a bit.
When you've got children who are grieving, your first concern is their welfare. I read something beautiful that a therapist wrote, that grief and loss like this is as if you're all in a plane that's crashed into the top of a mountain, and you're all going to have to find your way down, but you've all got broken bones, so you can't really help each other. You're all going to have to find your way down alone.
I can admit that I was definitely a little difficult. I think we had kind of clashed, but we definitely worked through it and realized that we were just both hurting, and there's no point in fighting with each other when we're both just going through that.
The grief comes at you like a wall. I think because I was alone, it turned out that I adopted a lot of the practices of Shiva. I'd been swimming every day, but I actually hadn't had a shower. And I certainly, there was no mirror in the shack, so I was making it up as I went along, but finding my own way to some of these things that have been enshrined for millennia in old religious practices. I first came to Flinders Island with Tony in 2001. I just fell in love with the place, the incredible beauty of the island. It's also a haunted place. So moving to see the cemetery where the English settlers have marked graves, but we know there are hundreds of Aboriginal souls also there, but their graves are not marked.
So this is Grandfather Manilagan's grave, where that rock is.
So you measured it out?
Oh yeah, and all of that is graves of our people. George Augustus Robinson bought them to remove all Aborigines from Tasmania, and they became slaves, basically.
It was murder in slow motion.
Most of the people bought from Tasmania died. So this is Manilagan. He's my great-great-great-great-grandfather, and a tribal chief. One of the...
He tried to protect his people.
He was the most amazing man. His strength and how he wanted to make sure his people would be okay. This was the community, and my grandfathers are here, and some of my cousins. My family is about 500 and they're all over the place. It was those women and their strength. They wouldn't give away their right to have a family and to bring us to life, really. Here we were born and survived. Sometimes I'll just sit up there and cry. Other times I walk through and say, hello, how are you? Is there anything you want us to do? Wyberlin is sacred to us because it knows the stories of our family, and that gives us some story and not just stories of death.
Well, I'd never read Tony's journals. They were his private thoughts, and I had never violated that. But I decided that now I would read them. Thoughts that he kept to himself when he was feeling insecure and unhappy, but also some hilarious shenanigans that he'd got up to before we got together. So that was a gift, because I thought that after he died, I'd never learn a new thing about him, but there it was. All Western societies like people to be happy. We get impatient with people. We don't give enough space for the business of being sad when you need to be sad.
I think the real moment that I cried in front of anyone was when we went to bury my dad's ashes. And I remember just putting the shovel into the ground and I just lost it. And I just remember in that car ride just bawling my eyes out. And it was the first real release I'd had.
I had needed to howl on the first day, but I didn't allow it because there was nobody there, and I thought if I lose it, I might not be able to re-find it. I couldn't cry. I mean, in a way, I was so shut down.
Obviously, there was something about that island spiritually, emotionally, that allowed her to open up to herself and to open up to her feelings.
There was one time on Flinders Island, and I was simultaneously back in my study the day I got that phone call. And the day I got that phone call, I was afraid to let go. I wanted to howl, but I didn't let myself because I was afraid if I lost control and I was all alone, I would lose it, and so I suppressed it. And I felt it coming back, and I let it come. And after that, I realized that the time had done what it needed to do, and I was ready to go home. I am super aware that I had an immense amount of privilege. I had time and space and resources to be alone and to grieve, and not everybody is going to have that. So what I wish for is a bit more kindness and understanding. And then I think when you're in grief, the best thing you can do is tell your story. And I don't know why, as a writer, I didn't realize that earlier on. Writers write. It wasn't until I wrote my story that I was able to feel like a normal human being again. It's work. You have to do the work. So whether it's to your friends, whether it's to a therapist, I think the important thing is to talk it out, to tell your story.
Well, I hope she's proud of it because it's the most beautiful piece of writing. Tony will always be there, always be in her head. But it's a deep bow to him.
Here's this beautiful writer who writes about the soul and about life. She's done this incredible meditation on death and the loss of her husband and grief. And the book ends up with, and don't forget to write down your passwords.
I arrived on Flinders Island, frankly, carrying a bag of crap. I'd been carrying it for 3 years. I gradually found that in the quiet, in the time, in the writing of it, in the self-understanding, I was able to take the junk out of the bag piece by piece. And I could feel, as the days went by, I was just getting lighter. So the grieving for Tony, that's not over. That goes on forever, and it gets more intense at times when you feel his loss at a joyful moment when you wish you could share it with him, at a sad moment when you need his support and his humor. But what I have been able to do was to set down that life I'd expected to have growing old with him, and just accepting that that life is gone. I ain't getting that back. And I just have to make the most of the life that I do have.